The ferry landing at Bracewick had no signboard, and when she stepped off the boat onto the wooden dock, no one looked up. That was all right. She had not come here to be looked at. The town sat at the edge of a long lake, the kind that went dark in the middle even on clear days. And the buildings along the main road were the color of weathered bone. She counted 3 that had been recently repaired. She could tell by the brightness of the new wood against the old, and 2 more that were losing the argument with gravity. Someone had tacked a piece of canvas over a broken window above the dry goods store. The canvas had been there long enough to fade. She had $19, a canvas bag, and a set of iron tools wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of it. The tools had belonged to her father. She had not come to sell them. She asked at the dry goods store where a person might find work. The man behind the counter was somewhere past 60, with a neck like a field post, and he did not answer right away. He looked at her the way people in small towns look at strangers, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular patience of someone waiting to see whether she would become a problem. She said she was looking for any kind of work. Repair work, if there was any. He told her the blacksmith sometimes took on help. The blacksmith's name was Galt. He was not a tall man, but he was wide in the shoulder, and he moved around his shop with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the same motions for 30 years and had removed everything unnecessary from them. When she came to his door and said she could work iron, he looked at her hands, not her face. He said he was not hiring. She said she was not asking for a position. She was asking for a day's trial. He said he did not see the point. She said she would work the morning for nothing. If he wanted her to leave at midday, she would leave. He picked up his hammer and went back to the piece he was working on. She understood that to mean she could stay. The forge was smaller than she was used to, but she had worked in small forges before. Her father had taught her in a shed barely large enough for 2, and half the shed had been taken up by a calf who wintered there. She found the rhythm of the place, the heat, the angle of the light, the way the bellows needed to be worked at a slightly slower pace than she was accustomed to because the channel was partially blocked and the draw was inconsistent. She did not mention this to Galt. She simply adjusted. By 9 in the morning, she had repaired 3 wagon wheel hubs, reset a cracked froe, and straightened a barrel bolt that someone had bent at a bad angle and then hammered at until it was usable but ugly. She made it straight. She made it smooth. Galt watched her work the bolt. He did not say anything, but when she finished and set it on the bench, he picked it up and looked at both ends, and she saw him notice where the metal was even and where the finish was clean. He said nothing, but he did not tell her to leave at midday. The woman who let her a room was named Mrs. Kenvale, and she ran a boarding house at the end of the main road where it bent toward the lake. Mrs. Kenvale was somewhere in her mid-50s, originally from Nova Scotia by the sound of her, and she had a way of talking that made everything sound like it was already settled and had been for years. The room was small and faced north. The window looked out onto a shed roof and, beyond it, a poplar stand that had gone yellow at the tips. She put her bag on the floor and her tools under the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the sounds the house made. It was a specific kind of quiet, the quiet of a house full of strangers who had agreed not to ask each other questions. She was comfortable in that kind of quiet. She had been living in it for 2 years. She had left Pictou County after the winter her father died, and the farm was sold to satisfy a debt she had not known about until the lawyer came to the door. The lawyer had been polite. That had been the worst part of it. She would have preferred anger. Anger, at least, she would have known what to do with. She had not gone back east since. She was not sure she ever would. In the morning she came back to the forge and Galt was already at work. He did not acknowledge her arrival, but he had left space at the second bench, and there was iron stacked at the end of it. She put on the leather apron that hung on the post and set to work. By the end of the 3rd day, she understood the shape of the shop, not just the physical layout, but the rhythms of it. She understood which work Galt would take on himself and which he would leave. She understood that he did not like to talk while the forge was running, and that he was precise about the temperature of the metal in a way that went beyond habit into something closer to belief. She understood that he had a daughter somewhere who sent letters that he did not open in front of others. She did not comment on any of this. She simply worked. On the fourth day, a man came in with a broken cultivator frame. He was a farmer, broad-faced, with the kind of permanent squint that came from working in open fields. He and Galt stood over the piece together, talking about whether it could be welded or needed to be recast. She was listening, not obviously. She had learned long ago that the best way to hear everything was to seem occupied with something else. The problem was not in the joint they were examining. It was in the frame itself, 3 inches back from the break, where the metal had developed a stress crack that was invisible unless you looked at the piece at a certain angle in the light. She had seen it when the farmer set it on the bench. She did not say anything. It was not her conversation. But when Galt turned to get a measuring gauge, she set down her hammer and tilted the piece slightly and held it toward the light from the high window. The farmer looked at her. She looked at the crack. After a moment, he looked at the crack too. He said, "What is that?" She said it was where the frame would break again, probably before next season. If they welded the joint and did not address the crack, the repair would not hold. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he supposed she was right. Galt came back with the gauge. The farmer pointed to the crack. Galt looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. He said, "She's been here 4 days. The farmer said, well, neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then, Galt set down the gauge, and they adjusted their plan for the repair. She went back to the piece she had been working on. She did not let herself feel anything about it either way. The argument started on a Friday, though she had not been present for the beginning of it and only heard about it afterward, from Mrs. Kenvale, who had heard it from the woman at the post office, who had apparently witnessed the whole thing. The argument was between 2 men on the town council about who was responsible for the community hall roof. The roof had been leaking since spring. It had been leaking since spring because someone had made a decision the previous autumn to patch it rather than replace the damaged section, and the patch had not held. Now the damage was worse. The question of whose fault this was had apparently consumed 2 full council meetings without resolution. She heard all of this at the boarding house supper table and said nothing, but she went by the hall the next morning on her way to the forge and stood outside for a few minutes and looked at the roof line. She could see where the problem section was without going up. There was a visible dip in the slope where the decking had rotted underneath and the surface had settled. Water would be pooling there every time it rained. She kept walking. Galt paid her at the end of the first week. The amount was fair. She did not comment on it, and he did not explain it. At the end of the second week, he paid her the same amount, plus a small addition. She noticed this and said nothing. Then, at the end of the third week, a man came to the forge asking for Galt specifically. He was from the council. She could tell by the way he carried himself, the particular kind of self-consciousness that came from being used to having people listen to you in a room. He said the town needed the hall roof fixed before the winter. He said the man they had been counting on had gone to Sudbury for family reasons and was not coming back before October. Galt said he was a blacksmith. The man from the council said he understood that, but he had heard Galt's knew. He paused, searching for a word. Assistant, he said, might have some knowledge in that area. Galt looked at her across the shop. She was at the bench, working. She did not stop working, but she was listening. Galt said, "That's her business to say." The man from the council looked at her. She set down her tongs and came to the door, and they talked for a few minutes about the roof. She asked about the decking, about what materials were available, about whether there was someone who could assist with the heavy sections. He answered her questions directly, which she appreciated. She asked one more thing, whether the council had a position on the work, meaning whether they would be reviewing every decision or whether she would be expected to proceed using her own judgment. He said they had a position on the roof, being fixed correctly before November. She said that would be enough. There was a hardware supplier in the next town who could get cedar shingles in the right grade. She sent a list. She also sent a note about the quantity, which was somewhat more than the surface area of the damaged section might have suggested, because she had looked at the north slope from the road, and it was showing the early signs of the same problem, not yet failing, but not far off. She did not ask permission for this. She included the reasoning in the note to the supplier and let the numbers speak. When the shingles arrived, a man from the council came to find her, not the one she had spoken to before, but another, younger, with a look that suggested he was there to perform a kind of oversight. He said, the order was larger than authorized. She said, the North Slope needs addressing this season, or you'll be doing this again in 2 years. He said the council had only agreed to the south section. She said she understood that. She also said that if he wanted to save the council the cost of a second job, he should let her show him the North Slope before making a decision. He followed her around the building. She showed him where to look and at what angle. He looked. He was quiet for longer than she expected. He said he supposed she was right. She said she would proceed with the full project then. He said he would need to bring it to the council. She said she would start on the south section while he did. She was already on the south section when he came back 2 days later to tell her the council had agreed. There was a boy who came by in the afternoons. He was perhaps 11, with an attentive look, and the habit of positioning himself somewhere useful without being asked, handing up shingles before she had to climb down for them, holding the chalk line taut without being told why. She had not hired him. He had simply appeared one day and made himself useful, and she had not told him to leave, and now he came every afternoon after school. His name was Dunbar, and he was Mrs. Kenvale's nephew. She had not known this until Mrs. Kenvale mentioned it over supper one evening, and even then she had not known quite what to do with the information. She only knew that he had a good eye for level and did not talk when it was not necessary, which were, in her experience, the two qualities that mattered most in any kind of work. One afternoon, they were on the North Slope, moving along a course together, and he asked her where she had learned to do this. She said her father had taught her. He had taught her blacksmithing first, but the rest of it had come the way it always came, because there was something that needed doing and no one else to do it. Dunbar said, "Was that hard?" She thought about it. She said it was hard in the way that most things are hard when you are doing them, and not hard at all when you look back. He seemed to consider this. Then he went back to work. She did too. The day the council chairman came to look at the finished south section, he brought 2 others with him, and they stood below the roofline and looked up at it for a long time. He said it looked solid. She said it was solid. He said, "You did this yourself." She said Dunbar had helped. The chairman looked up at the work again. She watched him look at it. She was curious what he saw, whether he saw the surface or whether he could see through to the work underneath, the replaced decking, the new drip edge, the careful line of the first course that everything else depended on. He looked at it for a long time. He said he thought perhaps they had been fortunate she had come to Bracewick. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the roofline herself, at the way the shingles sat, the way the line held from this end to the other without a dip or a rise. She said she thought perhaps she had been fortunate too. He seemed surprised by this. But he nodded, and the 2 men with him nodded, and after a while they all walked back up the road toward town. She stayed where she was for a minute longer. Winter came to Bracewick quickly, the way it did that far north, without much ceremony. One morning there was frost on the shed roof outside her window, and then a few days later there was snow, and then the snow stopped melting between days and she understood it would not melt again until spring. She had stayed in towns like this before and left them. She knew the particular feeling of a place becoming familiar. The way you stopped having to think about where things were. The way you started recognizing people before they were close enough to see their faces. That feeling had always made her restless before. She had not been able to name exactly what she was restless about until now. She understood it better now. She had been restless because familiar had never quite reached the same temperature as home. Bracewick was working on that problem. She was not ready to say more than that, even to herself. Galt asked her in October if she wanted to stay on through winter. He said it without ceremony, the way he did everything, looking at the piece in his hands rather than at her. She said she would need to know if the arrangement was different from the summer arrangement. He said it was the same, except that in winter there was more repair work and less fabrication because the farmers came in when the ground was too hard to work. She said that was fine. He said good then, and went back to what he was doing. That was all. It was, she thought, about the most direct conversation she had ever had with an employer, and she had worked for a number of people. In November, a letter arrived at the boarding house addressed to the hall restoration account, which had been set up temporarily in the name of the project, and which Mrs. Kenvale had agreed to receive. The letter was from a man in Parry Sound who had heard about the work on the hall from someone passing through, and who wanted to know if she was available for a similar project in the spring. She sat with the letter for an evening. She had spent 2 years moving, not running. She was careful about the distinction in her own mind, but moving, because there had not yet been a place that gave her a reason to stop. The work followed her, or she followed it, and the distinction had begun to seem academic. She folded the letter and set it on the windowsill. She wrote back in the morning. She said she was based in Bracewick and would be available for project work from May, provided the travel was reasonable. She said she could discuss terms by correspondence and come to Parry Sound for a site visit in April, if that was agreeable. She sealed the envelope and left it with Mrs. Kenvale for the morning post. Then she put on her coat and went to work. The morning she understood. She was not leaving came in early December, when the lake had gone to ice and the light came in low and long across it, and turned everything it touched into something that looked like it had been there since the beginning of things. She was walking back from the forge. She had been walking that road every morning and evening for 4 months, and she knew exactly where it went soft near the ditch and where the board sidewalk had a loose plank that lifted when you stepped on it. And she knew that the lamp outside the dry goods store flickered in a north wind but held in any other direction. She stopped on the road and looked at the lake. She had not expected this. She had not expected to find herself standing on a road she had walked 400 times and feel the particular stillness of a person who has stopped looking. She stood there for a moment. The cold was sharp and clear, and the ice on the lake made a low sound that was not quite cracking and not quite settling, but something between. She had come to Bracewick with $19 and a set of her father's tools and no plan beyond the next week. She looked at the lake for a little while longer. Then she turned and went inside, and she did not look at the trunk she kept at the back of the closet because she already knew she had not touched it in weeks. The stars came out early that night, the way they did in December, spilling out across a sky that had nothing to interrupt them. She lay on the narrow bed in the north-facing room and listened to the house settle around her and felt, without urgency, that she had arrived somewhere. Not at an ending. At a beginning that had quietly, without announcement, already begun.